Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today is day 123 of the ongoing war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. And a lot to cover today. Obviously, there has been some fairly serious setbacks for Ukrainian forces, specifically in the east, which is being talked about a little bit in terms of what's happening on the ground. But more importantly, there are some other issues right now that are really kind of threatening the cohesion of the Ukrainian military in its efforts to stymie the continued Russian operation into eastern Ukraine. But first and foremost, obviously, we have recently seen Ukrainian troops withdraw from Severodonetsk. Early indications by media outlets are saying that it was a orderly withdrawal. And that may be so in terms of what happened on the ground, and especially within the last 48, 72 hours. We believe here at MFAN most of Ukrainian heavy equipment was pulled out of Severodonetsk some time ago. But the real issue right now for the Ukrainians is what's happening near Lysychansk. And that situation is unfolding and is starting to unfold more rapidly in terms of Russian progress. Right now, Lysychansk, for all intents and purposes, is surrounded. We are looking at a Russian operation attacking it from the right flank. If this is the front, left, right, rear of Lysychansk, they're being attacked on the right flank. You also have a double envelopment occurring from the rear as Russian troops are now attacking and progressing towards the outskirts of the city via the attacking from west to east as well. So you're going to have a case where Russian forces are going to continue to harry the fortified areas around Lysychansk from the direct front. We don't believe there will be a mass river crossing of the Donets River across into Lysychansk. There are heights on the western bank of the river, which makes it fairly difficult for Russian forces to cross. But the Russians are not going to have to cross the Donets River to completely cut off Lysychansk. They will be able to attack Lysychansk from the south and from the rear as well, and that's kind of what's happening right now. We've heard reports that the Russians have advanced so far as the main glass factory that is on the southwestern side of Lysychansk, and the rubber factory and flea market to the south of Lysychansk as well. But again, things are not going well for Ukrainian forces in this area, and clearly you can see you don't have to be a military expert to take a look at this salient that has formed and this pocket that is forming with Ukrainian forces inside of that pocket. And just to make matters worse, this is a broad frontal operation extending well south of Lysychansk, with another target of Russian forces proceeding towards Bakhmut from the southeast, and from a frontal attack as well directly to Bakhmut's east. And obviously, that is a huge concern for Ukrainian forces as they continue to fortify roughly an area running from just south of Bakhmut all the way up towards Slavyansk. And then the reserve forces that are contained within Kramatorsk continue to be fortified as well with Ukrainian forces. But again, a very precarious situation for Ukrainian forces. Furthermore, we know a little bit more about the cruise missile strikes that the Russians conducted over the past 24 hours, in which we observed just about 50 long-range cruise missiles hitting various targets throughout Ukraine. And we believe at this point the Russians were targeting the training infrastructure of the Ukrainian armed forces. Specifically, Army training sites were hit, and the Ukrainian mobile infantry sites were also hit. So just like the Russians have almost a separate component of the armed forces, much like the U.S. Army and the United States Marines, you then have the Russian ground forces, and then you have the Russian airborne forces. Well, Ukraine does something very, very similar, where they have a ground forces component, and they also have the mobile infantry component, which specializes in airborne air assault operations. But they also have a very robust mechanized and armor capability as well, just like the Russians do as well in terms of their airborne forces. They're more or less elite shock-type infantry that are just kind of on a higher level than some of the other services within the Ukrainian military. Now, you also have within the confines of the Ukrainian armed forces is the Ukrainian National Guard, which is kind of another parallel force, and then you have the territorial defenses as well. So you have a varying components of what you would call the Ukrainian army in total that the Russians are targeting. And right now, it would appear that the Russians are going after the ability for Ukrainian forces to train new forces and then send them to the front line. And that is going to cause the Ukrainians some issue, as we already know that the Ukrainians are forward deploying members of the territorial defense forces. These were originally designed to fight, as I talked about in the previous video, in their local municipalities or oblasts. They were not designed to be deployed to the front line given the inadequate amounts of training. Really designed to set up checkpoints and go after maybe if there was some sort of long-range reconnaissance attack by Russian forces in the rear. They proved to be fairly effective in countering some of those operations, but they just don't have the training nor the internal capabilities in terms of support and heavy equipment that is going to help them in the ongoing conflict. And right now, the Russians are going after that ability of both the Ukrainian ground forces, the air mobile forces, the territorial defense forces, the National Guard, to train and equip forces at these sites in western Ukraine. So these sites are now being targeted by Russian cruise missile attacks, and we've seen recent attacks that took place in Desna, right up here. So again, this was the site of a ground forces infantry school that they were putting troops through their paces prior to deploying them to the front lines. We know that was hit. It's been hit a multitude of times, but it has been hit again within the last 24 hours. And then obviously in the west, one of the closest targets to the Polish border, which was originally headquartered of the 24th Mechanized Brigade. It also served as a training area for NATO partner forces to come in and train Ukrainian forces, and we know now that this has been hit again and again. The Russians are going after varying training sites throughout Ukraine to try and basically degrade the ability of the Ukrainian army to field additional reserve components and trained components of either the territorial defense forces, ground forces, air mobile forces, National Guard. But that's kind of what we've seen over the last 24 hours. We also observed additional strikes in downtown Kiev. This is probably not what I would say is the shock and awe capacity of the Russian military. It's difficult to say what the Russians were going after in Kiev. Obviously, the Ukrainians are reporting that a multi-story apartment building was hit, and it does appear that was the case. Now, the question is, what was hit that the Ukrainian forces are not talking about at this point? and in all likelihood, a sensitive target was targeted, was hit within the confines of downtown Kiev. It's very, very possible that one of these low-flying cruise missiles went off course or simply impacted in a high-rise building, as they do tend to fly lower and slower than a lot of other some of the sonic systems that the Russians are using, such as the Iskander ballistic missile system that is used quite often. But that's pretty much it right now. What I'll do is jump over to the other map where you can kind of see what's happened over the last until what I'm going to do is go back to June 20th roughly, and that'll give you the ability to kind of see what's happened again over the last 4 or 5 days or so. So I'll go back to the area around the Slavyansk, Severodonetsk, Bakhmut triangle. Obviously, you can't really call that the triangle. It's more of the Slavyansk, Lysychansk, Bakhmut triangle now, given the fact that Severodonetsk is now under Russian control. But go back to June 20th and just kind of see what exactly the Russians are up to. And you can see the situation obviously on June 20th looked quite a bit different. And then if we fast forward, you can kind of see what's happened. So in all likelihood, you may see an additional collapse of Ukrainian forces kind of in the far east, especially around Lysychansk. This position just, again, is just very, very difficult for Ukrainian forces to maintain, and in all likelihood, the map is probably going to get pushed just to the east of the M3 highway. Another issue right now that really is not being talked about a lot is that a lot of analysts over at the Pentagon had believed that Russia only had the capability to mount an offensive until roughly July. And the Pentagon is now acknowledging that it underestimated the amounts of munitions that the Russians have brought to bear in terms of being able to launch sustained and persistent mass artillery attacks upon Ukrainian forces. And again, we're seeing roughly, in some cases, 1,000 artillery rounds being fired out an hour, and in some cases per day, we're seeing as many as 50 to 70,000 rounds per day of heavy artillery, ranging from anywhere from 122 millimeter on up to 152 millimeter plus, all the way into the 200 and 300 millimeter artillery rounds and rocket rounds as well that are being fired. And it's continuing. And obviously, the thought process that Russia had not prepared to have the ability to sustain such an offensive is being currently proven as incorrect. Another issue right now that is kind of coming into play, and we're learning more about, is the shadow mobilization that we're seeing within the Russian armed forces. Obviously, the Russian armed forces took a tremendous amounts of casualties in the northern area of operation, specifically in the initial failed drive towards Kiev. But at the same time, we are starting to see a lot of these newer forces, and many of which were prior Russian service members who had previously served in the Russian armed forces, that have volunteered in terms of returning to duty. And we've seen roughly 40 to 50,000 additional non-conscripted volunteers joining up the Russian army, that is rapidly making up for the initial casualties that we're seeing in the ongoing Russian offensive. Now, obviously, we've received reports that some units, such as the 4th Russian Tank Division, has sustained really devastating casualties in the ongoing conflict, and that unit may be about 50 to 60% capacity right now. We also continue to hear about reports about the Russian airborne forces as well that have sustained damage. But it does appear that the Russian forces are making up for some of those losses with additional recruitment drives and additional contract forces kind of coming into play in those recruitment drives that are occurring throughout the country. We believe at this point Ukrainian forces are probably in the neighborhood of about 700,000, both active duty and recalled reservist forces. We don't believe Ukraine has quite hit that million personnel mark. It sounds like they're sitting right at around 700,000. That was some of the latest reports as of May that were coming out of the Ukrainian military. But again, a lot of these forces simply have not been adequately trained by the Ukrainian armed forces. Obviously, some of them, just like the Russian forces, have previous service record, which they do have that baseline knowledge of what they did when they were in the army. But obviously things have changed a bit, and obviously they need to get back into physical condition as well, and that's just something that's going to happen over time, and probably not going to occur within that 5 to 7 day training period that the Ukrainians are given those forces. Now, the other issue for the Ukrainians is something that I just talked about, is the fact that their training sites are being targeted and destroyed. And that makes it difficult to train as well. Whereas the Russians, on the other hand, are not having that same problem. The internals for the Russian forces to maintain its armed forces, the supply depots, the training sites are not being targeted by Ukrainian forces. So inherently, the Russians are going to have a much easier time training and replacing and getting new troops to the front lines, as opposed to the Ukrainian forces, which are having their supply depots attacked and these training bases attacked by Russian forces. So I hope you can see kind of what's happening and why Ukrainian forces are at such a disadvantage right now. Obviously, some Ukrainian forces are heading west into Poland and other western states to train, but by and large, the most of the training of Ukrainian forces in terms of just straight-legged infantry personnel, motorized infantry formations, these units that will eventually make their ways to the front, are being trained really kind of under hostile fire in western Ukraine at this point. So very, very difficult situation for Ukrainian forces, and we'll continue to see this pressure campaign by Russian forces, and I anticipate at some point we're going to see a rapid change in this western area of operations, specifically east and east of Sloviansk, north of Sloviansk, and really east of Kramatorsk, and just east of Bakhmut too. This kind of this pocket that is being formed here. So continue to watch, report, and bring you more information as it happens. Again, thanks for joining us, and we'll have more content very, very soon.